Wind scoured the top of the wall until it sang like a great white harp. Snow rose in dilating spirals and lay down again, softening rope and stone, choking the crenels and muting the world to a hush that made men whisper without knowing why. Jon Snow stood upon the heights in his black cloak, the hood thrown back so the cold might bite him honest. Ghost paced at his side, white as the drift except for those red eyes that took all things in and offered nothing back. Below to the south, Castle Black hunched low as if to make itself smaller before the storm. To the north there was nothing but white. He watched because watching soothed his mind, because silence left too much room for thoughts that came like knives. The ladder rattled behind him. A black shape climbed slow as old age. The man had bundled himself well, but the wind cut, and by the time he reached Jon, his face was raw and his eyes were running. "Rider from the east," he shouted over the gale. "Not one of ours. Wildling. Looks smaller than that. He says he brings a token for the Lord Commander. We've none of those at present, unless the king down there wants to style himself with our title." Down there Stannis Baratheon's banners planted their spears in snow and stone and would not be shaken. The king's men moved in tireless lines between their fires, devout and grim and smelling of smoke and horse. They had saved the wall, and their iron had not stopped singing since. "I'll come down," Jon said, and Ghost bounded along the walkway as if the ice held no terror at all. The rider waited beneath the shadow of the wall, where the wind had teeth even in the lee of the great white. His pony was shaggy and done. He himself might have been no more than a boy, narrow and green-gray as the rushes that poked from the swamps of the neck. The spear lashed to his back was old and well cared for, and a necklace of polished shells lay on his breast. He bowed without lowering his eyes, frog-bright and wary. "I am Hake of Greywater," he said, "a messenger for Jon Snow, who was a son of Winterfell before he was a brother of the Black." Ghost stepped forward, nose lifting. The crannogman did not flinch. Jon kept his voice easy. "I am Jon Snow." The boy blinked at him as if this answer surprised him. He slipped a skin-wrapped bundle from his saddle and held it two-handed, as one gives a sword hilt first. "I bear words sent by my lord Howland Reed and by Lady Meage of Bear Island and by Galbart Glover, true men to the young wolf." He glanced south with a quickness that betrayed fear. "I was told to place this only in your hands." Steel hissed as two of the king's men stepped nearer. Jon raised a palm and took the bundle. The seals were half obscured in frost. A snarling bear, a towered tree, and the dire wolf of Stark impressed deep in gray wax. The knot in Jon's belly pulled tight. The wind battered his ears. He could not tell whether his heart beat hard because of hope or dread. "Come in out of the cold," he said, because it was the kindness due a man far from home. "You'll have hot soup. I'll read these where the wind won't steal the words from me." Hake of Greywater bowed again and followed, light on his feet in his bark-soled shoes. In the Lord Commander's chambers the fire made a low crackle, and the smell of wood smoke gentled the rawness in the air. The room had never been the old bear's since Mormont died in the haunted wood. The chair was the same, the table, the ashy hearth. But it seemed that something had shrunk, or that Jon had grown past a size in which rooms could make him feel held. He broke the seals one by one, the wax flaking under his thumb. The paper crinkled with a sound like dry leaves. There were several pages. One bore the crabbed hand that had marked his childhood summers with lessons on swamps and stranger warriors, sketched in the margins with leaves and spears. Another was bold and spare. Meage Mormont's letters looked like a woman who had never written anything she would not fight to uphold. The last sheet was thicker vellum, smooth as an old antler. The script was Robb's. Jon went cold as the wall. He had not seen that hand since the last time a raven from the south had brought news of the young wolf's victories, before the ravens that brought no words or worse ones. The letter's first line named witnesses. The second named a king. The third named a brother. He read until the words blurred. Robb wrote as he had spoken, with a stubborn clarity that made other men give ground. The decree, if the crannogman's careful explanations of seals and countersigns were true, did not petition. It declared, Jon Snow of Eddard Stark's blood, was by word of king and court named lord and lawful heir to Winterfell and to any titles and dignities that attached. Sansa Stark, now wed in King's Landing, was by that same writing set aside. Bran and Rickon, believed dead and mourned by all the North, were commended to the gods and to remembrance. Mormont and Glover had placed their names and witnesses. Howland Reed had set his sign, a towered tree with a crowned man peering from its roots. The direwolf seal was thick where Robb had pressed it. There were words for what must be done in the North, against treachery, against bastards crowned with wolfskins who served Freys and iron men. The summons was clear in law and bone both. Jon put the sheet down. Ghost nosed at his knee and made a soft sound. A growl so low it might have been a purr if dire wolves purred. Maester Aemon's gaze went from the documents to Jon's face and back again. The old man's eyes were white milk in a river of wrinkles, but some keen watchfire smoldered behind them yet. He had called for Aemon, and the king had invited himself like winter. Stannis Baratheon stood with his hands clasped behind him, Melisandre's shadow licking the stone behind his shoulder. Davos Seaworth in the doorway smelling faintly of salt and tar. So, Stannis said at last, when the silence had grown as taut as a bowstring, a dead boy makes a dead man's bastard into a lord. If we live by such phantoms, we shall freeze on the wall and be buried behind it. Davos cleared his throat very softly. With respect, your grace, the phantoms have names and seals. These are not the whispers we have heard about in the south. They are a king's words writ and witnessed. Words, Stannis said. You know what words did to my brother. Words crowned him too, Melisandre said, her voice the color of hot iron. The ruby at her throat pulsed like a slow heart. And words can call a man from shadow into truth, if the hour demands it. Jon's mouth felt dry. Robb was no shadow. No, Stannis said. His bones prove as much, I am sure. But his crown is a shadow now, and I am the only light left to banish such shades. Aemon shifted in his chair. All crowns cast shadows, your grace. Jon looked at the fire and saw the colors of Winterfell in it. Smoke and gray and the soft gold of dawn on old stone. He heard Arya's laugh. He felt the weight of Robb's arm thrown around his shoulders after they had tumbled in the snow behind the kennels. Boys with snow for blood and wolfish breath. When he spoke his voice remained steady, and that surprised him. I am sworn, he said, by my own will. Robb knew it. He wrote this knowing it. Hake of Greywater dipped his head. He wrote it because he knew it. He said that only a man who wanted no crown would hold it clean, and only one raised with Ned Stark could guard the North's heart without selling it for a Lannister bride. He told my lord, that is, my father's lord, to keep the writ quiet until there was need. He said the need would know itself. Convenient of need, Stannis said. It always does. Davos rocked on his heels. Your grace, the need is plain. The Boltons sit you down with the Freys at their right hand. The Iron Men hold Moat Cailin. The North bleeds under cold knives. Most of the North loved the Stark boy. This may be the only paper that makes them remember they loved a king, not merely a boy. If this boy is a king, he's a king in black, Stannis said. The vows forbid it. The vows forbid wives and lands and gold and crowns, Aemon murmured. But the vows were written for a time when the wall kept out raiders with bronze knives and mammoths bellowing in the snows. Times change. Oaths endure, but their shadows move with the sun. I do not say break them. I say see them true. Jon felt a pain behind his eyes, as if the cold had slipped beneath his skull. I will not break my vows. Melisandre's attention seemed not to be in the room. She watched the flames and smiled faintly. No, she said, you will not. But you will be a king all the same, though not as men measure kings. The words raised the hair on Jon's arms. He kept his eyes on the Crannogman boy. Where will you go after this? Back to the swamps, Hake said. Where a man can hide even from a winter with sharp teeth. My lord said to tell you that the neck is not wood and water alone. It has memory, and that memory keeps its promises. He said to tell you that winter is old in the neck, and old things remember. I will send you safe. Safe is a reed on water. the boy said. He smiled, and the smile flicked away. Better than ice that looks like ground. When they were gone, Hake and the king, and Melisandre with her eyes on the fire in some room that existed only for her. Jon stood with his hands on the table until the grain printed his palms. Aemon waited because he always had, with patience that could calm storms. "I should burn it," Jon said at last. Not because he meant to, but because the thought had come like a moth and battered itself into light. "Do you think fire ends things?" Aemon asked. "When I was young, we thought swords did. We learned different. I cannot be both." "You cannot," Aemon agreed. "The gods have cruel economy that way. Still, the men of the north, hearing this, will wake. They will name you in their halls and curse you at their tables and sharpen blades in your name. It will have weight. You cannot forbid weight." "I can refuse it." Aemon raised a trembling hand. Ghost moved to push his great head beneath it, and the old man smiled, his blind eyes gone bright with what he felt under his fingers. "There is a kind of king who refuses," he said, "and in refusing becomes the measure of other men's oaths." Stannis sent for Jon the next morning before the dawn had lifted its shoulder. The air smelled of horses and rime. In the king's cold pavilion, maps were spread and pinned with knives. Davos stood by, hands clasped. Melisandre remained between the world and her seeing like a bright wick in a lamp. "I offered you Winterfell," Stannis said without preamble. "I offer it still, but now I must add that I will recognize this boy's paper as the law of the North. I will proclaim you Jon Stark if you kneel, and if you and yours ride under the fiery heart." He does not say, Jon thought, that the fiery heart must burn the seven, the old gods and the new, and all other lights. He does not say that I must take Val, or some spear maiden, as proof that old strange blood flows under kingly cloaks. He doesn't have to. "I thank you," Jon said, and because gratitude is rawer than any complaint it felt like sand in his throat. "But I will not take Winterfell if the price is my oath." Stannis's jaw worked once, twice, like a smith drawing an iron out of stubbornness. "I had thought you would say so." "Very well." His mouth became a thin line. "If you will not wear the crown the wolves would put on your head, wear a command I can trust. Let your brothers elect you Lord Commander." "They will. I can make it so." Jon thought of Janos Slynt and Alliser Thorne and their cold eyes crawling over him like bugs. He thought of the way men looked away from him when he passed because they had heard he lay with wildlings and then returned to Ewall, as if the memory of a woman's hair between a man's fingers was such a crime as to cancel all else. He thought of Donal Noy dying at the gate, and Ygritte dying in his arms. He thought of the night when he had climbed down the wall with fire behind his eyes and snow under his hands and thought he would never climb up again. "My brothers will elect as they see fit," he said. "They see as they are told," Stannis said, dismissive. "And I can tell them." Davos spoke then, careful as a man stepping onto new ice. "Your Grace, there might be better coin to spend. If the North hears that a king in the North waits at the wall and will not come, they will wait for him to do it. If the North hears instead that their king holds the wall and will stand it or die on it, they may rally to you for that very stubbornness. It is a strange thing, but men love a thing more if they think it cannot be had." Stannis made a sound that might have been amusement and might have been a cough. "A smuggler giving me counsel on kings and love." "I smugged onions, Your Grace," Davos said, as dry as driftwood. "Not hearts. But I've watched enough men to know one from the other when I see it." Melisandre's smile was thin, and if it held pity, it was not the sort a mortal woman gave. "Let the boy be what he is," she said. "A light behind old ice. The wall is a sword without a hand. Put a hand to it, and it can cut." Alice Karstark came through the snow with fear hurrying at her heels. 2 days later, she came riding a shaggy mare with ice crusted in its mane, and when they brought her in and slipped her from the saddle she swayed like a reed, then straightened and glared as if daring the world to move. The men pursuing her were not far behind. Their banners were black trees in a white sea, their captain a lean man with a smile as hard as glass. He called himself a true man of Stannis while whispering that he had letters from Roose Bolton folded in his breast. He smiled when Janos Slynt's name was invoked and smiled when Alliser Thorne's was. He smiled when he lied. Alice's mouth was a tight line of stubborn Karstark. She is promised to a man old enough to be her grandsire by Arnulf's word, the captain said, soft as soup. She fled in a fit of maiden folly. We are here to save her from sin as much as from shame. You are here to sell her womb to a traitor, Alice said, without lifting her voice. And if there is sin in me, it is this, that I ran not sooner. Jon remembered a girl running through the gods' wood at Winterfell with her hair streaming, as if a horse's mane had sprung from her head. He remembered laughter. He set the memory aside as you set a knife aside. Within reach. The Karstarks bent the knee to the Boltons, he said. We bent our knee to survive winter, the captain said. Is there any man here who would not take that bargain? A man cannot keep his honor if he is dead. Jon smiled. It was a northern thing, sharp as an icicle and useless if you held it long. There is a kind of honor that lives in the bones. He married Alice to Sigorn, the Magnar of then, in the old god's sight, with snow falling soft as ash on their hair. The wall watched them, and the Black brothers watched, and Stannis's men muttered, and Melisandre's eyes went bright as she breathed words in a tongue older than the seas. Alice's face, which had been hard as iron, softened as if something long clenched had finally uncoiled. Sigorn looked as if he had been told he could take a raven and teach it not to fly, and the raven had done it for love. You make odd matches, Stannis said afterwards. Odd matches make odd loyalties, Jon replied. I have need of both. The days grew taller as the sun made her long way back north, but the cold did not unfasten its teeth. Men went missing in the snow and returned with lies in their mouths or did not return at all. The wall went about its work as it always had. The ice was walked, the fires mended, the latrines dug, the broth tasted for poison by men who laughed because there was nothing else to do. Stannis's knights rode the forest edge and brought back wood and mutters about frozen lakes that cracked under banners, about hills that moved under their horses because men waited under the white with knives between their teeth. Rumor came in with the wind and left with it. Stannis had taken Deepwood Motte, Asha Greyjoy had yielded, the weirwoods in the Wolfswood had begun to whisper again, and this time the whisper had a name in it. Men said the name with careful teeth. Manderly, White Harbor fat Lord Wyman, who smiled and ate and smiled, whose son had died at the Red Wedding and who had sung after. He sent a letter on heavy paper with a green wax merman holding a trident, and the letter smelled faintly of spiced wine, as if the words had warmed themselves before he wrote them. He called Jon lord and nephew both, sprinkled with gallant courtesy, and explained in a hand so neat it might have been carved that he would raise the Manderly strength if the North had a Stark to follow, and that in this he was as stubborn as a bank of the white knife in winter. He would not flow except where the land permitted, and he named the land by name. The letter ended with something like an apology and something like a promise. I am sending a servant to fetch me what was thought lost. If he returns, you will have more choices than one man ought. If he does not, forgive an old fat man for indulging one old fat hope. There was another letter. It was short and smelled of tallow and blood and worse things. The wax was pink. Jon read it aloud in a voice so level it startled him to hear it. Ghost stood at his knee with his ears laid flat, as if the paper itself stank. The letter said that Stannis had fallen and that Mance Rayder had burned, that the Queen's Red which had howled like a bitch in heat when they fed her king to the flames, that Winterfell would be kept by the only man who could, that Jon Snow was a bastard and a traitor and would be flayed for both if he dared set foot south of the wall. It named men Jon had sent out into the cold and promised him their fingers and their teeth each bound with twine to keep count. It named him Ramsay. A crack opened in the room like ice breaking underfoot. The men who had gathered, Black brothers, and Stannis's captains with their stiff faces, and the wildling chieftains staring like wolves from the edge of a lantern's light, made the soft sounds men make when they are forced to swallow anger. Jon felt something inside him stand. It did not rise, he had no sense of rising. It simply stood where it had been crouching. I am riding south, he said. The murmurs tightened. He looked at the men who had bled on the wall beside him and thought of words he had spoken just days past. He thought of Aemon's blind eyes in the firelight. He thought of Stannis, whose banners might be ash by now, or whose banners might have been planted in snow somewhere he could not see. He thought of Robb's hand on vellum, writing a name that was his. Not to claim a castle, Jon said. Before Davos could open his mouth and before Bowen Marsh could say brother in that pleading way that tried to make a rope of the word. I ride for my men, for the wildlings I sent to come in out of the cold, for a girl who came to me running because the world behind her mouth was closing, for the old gods' woods that have been listening too long to men who spit into their roots. The wall does not end because a mad boy writes my name in pink. He will not stop. If I do nothing, he will keep writing in red. It is not our war, Bowen Marsh said. There was grief in him like frostbite, the kind that blacks the flesh before a man can feel it. Our vows are a sword, Jon said. Do you only hold a sword in your own yard? There is a fire in the wood. If we do not go where it burns, we will be ash by morning. You would break the watch, Marsh said, and in his voice now there was more terror than anger. He looked at the men gathered in the hall, and in that glance Jon saw that this was not the first speech Marsh had practiced. It was the first he had dared. You would make us the footmen of a Stark king. You would put crowns back on heads and call it duty. You would, Ghost growled once. It was a sound like a door closing. I would spare you your speeches, Bowen, Jon said, and there was sorrow in it. I have heard them in my dreams already. I ride as Jon Snow, and for every man who will come with me there is a place at my side. For every man who will not, I will not take your cloak from your back. But I will go. He had thought the room would crack open like a pond under a weight, and in a way it did. Lines raced out from where he stood and laced the floor. The men arranged themselves upon those lines. Tormund Giantsbane grinned and clapped a hand to his axe. Pip would have whistled and said something that hid his courage behind foolishness. Gren would have gone where Pip went, steady as a cart horse. But they were bones under cold ground now, and the space where they might have stood was a wound that never closed. Dolorous Ed sucked his teeth and said that if they were going to die, he supposed he would rather die in a place with roofs, for a change, and men laughed because you must. Alliser Thorne stared at Jon as a man stares at an arrow he cannot pull from his flesh and live. Janos Slint looked at Davos as if the smuggler's face would tell him the way the wind would blow and found no help there at all. It might have gone to daggers then. It had been going to daggers for weeks. But the door opened, and with the cold came Midge Mormont as if she had been carved from bare bone. Snow in her hair, a brown cloak crusted white. With her was Galbart Glover, harder in the face than the last time Jon had seen him, which had been never and yet had been always. The faces of Northmen blur one into another when they are grim and tired and bent on a thing. Behind them moved half a dozen others, men with the pelt smell of the wolfswood and the stone weight of the barrows. We had some trouble with Freys, Midge said, as if she were apologizing for soil on her hem. They do not turn aside easy, but we turn them aside when we must. We were not sure whether to find you in black or in gray. I see that question answers itself. Galbart Glover set a leather tube upon the table with the same care a man gives a sleeping child. The will is reed, he said. The land knows it. The neck knows it. The mountains know it. We come to know what the man knows whose name is written there. Jon's mouth felt full of winter. That I am a brother, he said, and the words were heavy, but they did not crack. That I am a son of Eddard Stark. That I will not wear a crown while the ravens fly and the dead walk. That I will not see the north ruled by a flayed man. Midge snorted in approval. A crown is a pretty thing to set aside. You would not be changing your Stark skin for a Baratheon's yellow paint, would you? She threw Stannis a glance that was insolence if the man had been any other man, and merely a fact if he were himself. I hear this king kept you alive and put nights between you and the cold. That is something. We accounted him as much as we accounted any man who would get us through the snow with our toes on. We have words for you, my lord, from men who do not write theirs in pink. Wyman Manderley sends his love to Ned's memory and his sword to Ned's sons. Moore's Umber sends 3 fingers he bit from a fry. I have them if you like. They were frozen and so they kept, though one got soft when we camped too close to the fire. The Riswells send horses and smiles you should not believe. The Mormonts send daughters. She laughed then, A bear's rumble. We have plenty of those. We will send them wherever they are required to make men remember what their hands are for. Rickon, Davos said. The name move. D through the room like a fish under reeds. Meej's face changed. Something old and soft moved through her as if a child had run across her mind. Wyman sent a man to find him. Sent me, Davos said. He put his hand to his breast where a scar lay, though few men knew it. I found more than I set out for. I found teeth and bones and black water under stone. I found a boy with a wolf bigger than any dog in any lord's hall and eyes that had never once looked down. I found Skagos. I found your brother. The room tilted. Jon put his hand flat on the table. The grain bit his palm. Is he? In the flesh, Davos said. Thin as a sapling and wild as the wind that blows off rocks. But alive. Manderly's ships will have him in White Harbor before another turn of the moon if no storm eats them. And if you have ever known a fat man in love with a thing he could hold, you'll know no storm dares. Men made sounds again. The Black brothers shifted. The wildlings watched as if wolves had walked into a den of dogs. Stannis looked at the smuggler and did not speak at once. The red woman's eyes had gone far away and bright again. Galbart Glover put his hand upon the tube as if he would steady it if the room tossed it. Then it is done, Bowen Marsh said. His voice broke and then hardened, as ice breaks and then refreezes. You will never be Lord Stark. The boy is trueborn. Jon wanted to laugh. Came over him like heat. I never meant to be. You did, Marsh said. You stood in this room and made yourself a king. You planned it with letters and with a bearwoman and with a smuggler and with a witch. You! Meej Mormont moved before anyone else thought to. She got to Bowen Marsh in 3 steps and took him by the throat. She lifted him until his toes scraped the floor. Her face was close to his, and her voice was the sound of an axe biting a stump. Say witch again, she told him, and I will show you witchcraft. I will pull your nose off with 2 fingers. The only magic in this hall is the one that keeps a man's tongue from running when it ought to walk. Lady, Stannis said. She dropped Marsh, who coughed and clutched his neck and stared at her with a hatred that had been given shape and force. Jon saw the shape and recognized it and was sad, because there was no unmaking some shapes once a man had poured himself into them. Rickon is a boy, he said, and his voice steadied itself on the only thing it could find. He will need a castle that remembers him, and men who will not teach him to love flaying. He will need time to grow into the name of Stark. He will have both, if I have to steal them day by day from a winter that does not share. Stannis said, a boy cannot unite a realm. A boy needs a hand. Jon looked at him. Sansa is in the Vale or in the hands of Lannisters, if she lives. Arya. His throat closed. He remembered a gray horse and a boy missing from his place at table and a girl missing with him, and every mouth in Winterfell saying a different story they all knew was a lie. Bran is dead or worse than dead, if the worst you can imagine is all there is. Rickon is a boy. A boy needs a hand. But his hand cannot be a sword that points at the wall. So you will send another, Stannis said. Choose it, then. Glover? The bear woman? The fat lord? Wyman Manderly? Meej said at once. He has a mouth full of greed and a heart full of old songs. That is what a boy needs. He drinks too much. That is also what a boy needs, if the man who drinks knows when to put his cup down. Galbart Glover inclined his head. I would say my brother Robert, if I might, for he thinks as hard as he fights, but he has more enemies than a man should try to put between a boy and a bed. Manderly is soft at the edges and granite in the middle where you cannot see. He will do. Jon thought of slow rivers and fat kings in Southron tales who were stupid, and of the look Wyman Manderly would have put on to make men think him harmless, and of the bones of a son that might smell of gravy if a man could force his mind to it. He thought of a girl's bones carried home under pies. He did not let the taste reach his tongue. Manderly as regent, he said. Meej to break jaws when soft words fail. Glover to keep count and keep counsel. Stannis to put his men where they can do harm to my enemies and no harm to my friends. He looked at Davos. The smuggler to carry my words because he will not be put off by closed doors. And you? Davos asked. Where will you put yourself? On the wall, Jon said. Where I swore to be. They left him then, most of them, to make their arrangements with snow in their hair and grudges in their pockets. Not Marsh. Marsh stayed and watched him like a man takes aim at dusk. I do not forgive you, Marsh said. You took our oaths and made them into a ladder. I took our oaths and made them into a path, Jon said. Both climb. One goes somewhere. You will die for this. We will all die for something. He thought of Eamon, blood thin as old soup, whispering of the boy he had been, a prince who had turned his back on the name that could have made him king, and dying as a brother more honored than any number of lords. He thought of Robb, a boy who had turned toward a crown and died because he was bold and because he was wrong in the wrong place. He thought of Ygritte, who had known nothing and everything and had chosen him anyway. He thought of Ghost, and of the way the direwolf's eyes held him to the world when his mind drifted to places colder than cold. I mean to live long enough to make the dying count. The march south was not a march. It was a series of decisions made in snow. Men fell and they did not rise again, and their names were counted that night by Ed Tollett, who took no pride in his counting. The wind grew knives. Snow moved across the land like a beast entirely at its ease. Jon learned the ice's moods as a man learns the moods of a horse. When it would shy, when it would bite, when it would run under him without waiting to be asked. He put Tormund in command of the van and told him in so many words not to risk more than he could afford. I'll risk less, Tormund said, bright with cold. I've seen the Bolton Lord's men in the trees. They wear their skins wrong. They put salt on their snow. They make sticks scream. Let them wait behind their walls. They were born waiting. The snows softened as they neared the Wolf's Wood and the low land around Winterfell, and then hardened again into ruts that could break a man's ankle if he was proud. Smoke rose sometimes in slow plumes against the white. They found farms deserted, stores burned, old men who would not move and young women who could not, children with eyes like ghosts. They found Freys. Those they left in the ditches for the crows, and if any crows came, Jon did not see them. The birds were all gone, and only the wind spoke in the trees. Stannis had not fallen. He had broken the Karstark treachery on a frozen river and left the ice red where it failed, and moved like a spear point through country that had never seen a Southron king. The North did not rally to him. The North was a series of doors half shut, eyes watching from between. But it followed, in a way, as a pack follows a wolf that may or may not be leading them to meet. When they met at last, near a town that had been a town once and now was merely a set of shapes under white, Stannis looked less like a king and more like a piece of iron that had been banged into the shape of one until it held. You live, Jon said, and found that he was glad. Stannis looked at him a long time and then nodded, as if to admit that he did indeed. Davos grinned. The grin made lines around his eyes deep as rope furrows. He does, he said. The Freys don't. Melisandre smiled and said that the flames had shown her a red lake and wolves drinking. Jon hoped the wolves had eaten before they drank. He thought of Mance Rayder and did not ask after him. Stannis would not answer that question, or would answer it with a sentence that was not an answer at all. Melisandre would answer with a poem. Davos would answer with his eyes. Better not to ask. Winterfell, Jon said. The word made something knot in his throat. Stannis looked to the east where the low red mark of dawn made a bruise in the snow. A castle, he said. A symptom. Cut away the diseased flesh. The body will still be sick. But a man must do what a man can. The banners of the flayed man flew above Winterfell. Smoke rose from its chimneys in long, slow drags. Jon saw the gatehouse and felt something twist in his belly, the way a blade twisted when a man pulled it out to make the wound bigger. On the road, a naked tree stood with 3 things nailed to its upflung hands. They had been men. A strip of parchment flapped from one corpse's mouth like a tongue. It had been pink once. The wind worried it to pieces, and the pieces blew away. They had numbers enough to make a fool try to storm. Jon had seen enough fools in his life to count himself lucky not to be one more. He set Tormund and the Thens to their work and watched the wall for change. Stannis made plans. Davos spoke to men through doors and came back with news about wheat stores and hearts. Midge Mormont walked the camps as if she owned them and set men to rights with a look or a cuff. Galbart Glover became the hub of a wheel of small schemes that moved the larger scheme forward an inch and then another inch, like hauling a ship up a beach. Jon went alone to the God's Wood under Winterfell's wall when the night wore its deepest black. He knew the way without knowing he knew it, and when the old heart tree rose before him it felt as if he had never left. Snow lay upon the weirwood's face like veils. He brushed it away. The sap had dried brown, lines like dried tears across the white carp. He put his palm to it. The bark was cold and steady under his hand. Ghost moved in a slow circle, sniffing. "Father," Jon said, because he was alone, and because the tree had his father's silence if not his face. The word made his mouth flood with the taste of childhood, oil and leather and the dull sweetness of baked apples. "I haven't found them all. I don't know where Arya is. Sansa." He stopped. "Rickon is alive. Robb is dead. Bran. If I say his name here he will hear me, and I do not know what would come. I named no king and men named me anyway. I will not take a crown. I don't think I could hold it, but I can hold a gate while my hands last." The wind moved, and the old tree's branches lifted and let fall snow. Some of it drifted onto Jon's shoulder. Felt like a blessing, felt like a warning. The gods had a way of doing both at once. Dawn came thin and gray. The men in Winterfell woke to banners where there had been none, to horns where there had been silence, to wolves' heads painted on skin-stretched shields where there had been only flayed men. Stannis moved his pieces without pause. The Thens slid like shadows and set fire where it would eat slowly and not be noticed. Tormund sent men to slip through posterns the map said should be bricked. Men do not brick the posterns they use. The gates opened because the gates are always where men think themselves safest. The first men threw war Bolton's colors. They died under snow in a rush that was too quick to have the feel of war. After that it was war. Jon did not remember pieces of it when he tried to later and wondered if it was because Melisandre had thrown some of the day into her fire. He remembered a man with a half-sewn face trying to laugh and failing. He remembered a boy with hair the color of old straw wearing a white leather cloak that had once been clean. He remembered a woman on the wall with a bow who shot and shot and shot again until someone dragged her away by her hair. He remembered Ramsay Snow, not by face, by smell, by sound. There was a quality to the HEIR arrow. A man like that, as if animals had learned words solely to curse him. Jon fought his way through that air. He found rooms where the stone remembered better days and corridors where the ghosts of old wolves lay down in puddles of water. He found himself at last in the great hall with its banners thrown down and its boards thrown over, and a man with eyes the color of Ice's belly wiped his knife on a girl's hair and turned. "Bastard," Ramsay said, as if the word were a spear to cast. "You should have come sooner. I would have given you a dog's chain and called it a crown." Jon's sword went up. Ramsay's did also. They met under broken antlers. Jon had killed before and would kill again, but there are deaths a man knows belong to him before he hands them to the stranger. This was one. It did not feel like a victory. It felt like a reckoning paid with coin that had been owed so long it had become part of the earth. When it was done, Jon looked down at the boy who had been loved by no one anyone should mention and loved himself too well, and felt nothing like triumph. He felt cold. He felt tired. He thought of pink wax and of parchment used to keep count of fingers. He thought of a wolf's head sewn to a boy's neck. He put his sword away because there was nothing left to cut. They opened the gates. Winterfell breathed like a man who has had a knife taken out of his side and knows he may still die of the wound. Men cheered because men must. Others sat down on the ground where they stood and slept. Snow fell and turned blood into a glaze that glinted like rubies under the pale sun. Rickon Stark came to Winterfell as the gulls came to White Harbor, late and loud and reckless with wildness. He rode in front of half a dozen manderly men on a garron with a mane like a shadow, and Shaggy Dog ranged before him with teeth like bone sickles. The boy had grown without growing tame. His hair was a briar. His cheeks were wind-burned and his lip was split. His eyes were wrong and right both. They were the North's eyes. When he saw the courtyard his mouth opened and he laughed. And when he saw Jon the laugh went out of him and something else came. He slid from the saddle and ran. He did not run the way a lord runs. He ran like a cub. He hit Jon and clung and did not cry, and because he did not, Jon did. Shaggy Dog sniffed at Ghost and made a sound. Ghost returned it. The two great wolves circled and leaned and finally lay down with their bodies touching shoulder to hip, as if they were brothers long parted who had found one another without saying anything at all. Wyman Manderley dismounted with a grunt and bowed as deep as his belly would permit. He beamed as a man beams when he has brought a gift the gods themselves would have blinked at. "My lord," he said to Jon and then to Stannis, "Your Grace, I bring you Winterfell's boy. He is more thorn than rose, but roses don't have much use here of late. I found him where only a man who had once stolen onions would think to hide." He twinkled at Davos, and Davos spread his hands as if to deny a truth everyone knew. "Your Grace, I bring you a Stark for your north. My lord, I bring you a Stark that your father made and your father's gods kept." They held court in the great hall, where the fire made the shadows jump like men dancing. Stannis stood and did not sit because sitting suggested comfort. Rickon sat because he was a boy. He kicked a table leg with his heel when he was bored and flung a slice of bread to Shaggy Dog when he thought no one saw. Wyman Manderley stood like an island with floods in his eyes. Meej Mormont watched and dared anyone to object to what she had decided would be done. Galbart Glover kept count of names as they were sworn, because names are tally marks in the north and you spend them like coin if you are foolish. Jon knelt before Rickon. He felt the weight of Winterfell in his knees. "Lord Stark," he said. Rickon's mouth twisted. "You're my brother." "I am. I think I shall be your bannerman also, if you will have me." "I will," Rickon said. The boy's eyes flicked to Stannis because he was not a fool, not that kind, and then to Manderley, and then to the swords on the walls. "But you can't go." Jon lifted his head. "I cannot stay. You're my wolf." Rickon's face worked. He had been taught to say my and lord in the same breath, but he had not had the years to make it habit. "You're my wolf and my brother and the walls man also. You can't be three things." He put up 3 fingers and stared at them intently, as if he might make them fold by will. "Maybe I can be 2, Jon said. "I can be your brother and the walls man. Cannot be your lord. That belongs to you." Rickon scowled, and then the scowl broke like ice under sudden weight and sea water flashed beneath. "I wanted you to be all of them," he said, as if the world were stubborn just to spite him. "I want Bran and Robb and father and mother and the girls and all the dogs. But I got this." He jerked his chin at the hall where men were swearing words they would later call oaths. "Will you stay tonight?" "I will," Jon said, and thought of the godswood and of the face of the tree and of a chair that would never be his and was his more than any other chair would ever be. In the night he dreamed he was a boy again, and Winterfell was whole, and he ran with Ghost through drifts that came to his knees and listened to the crack of ice on pond's edge and the bark of seals out on the white. He woke with the taste of apple in his mouth and his hair stiff with icy breath. Ygritte's hair lay across his face as if for a moment she had lain down beside him to borrow his warmth. When he moved, it was only a twist of blankets. He found Stannis in the yard before dawn, as he had known he would. The king did not look at Winterfell as men looked at a place one. He looked at it the way a smith looks at a blade that will need sharpening every morning and still nick under the hand of a fool. Melisandre stood behind him like a flame behind glass. Davos rubbed his hands and watched the sky because a sailor always does. "Your work," Stannis said without warmth, which was to say with respect. "Your boy sits a chair that will try to teach him to love it. He has wolves that will teach him other things. You will return to your wall." "I will," Jon said. "I will leave men who love me less than they love the North to make certain the North is not a thing men sell in small pieces." Stannis's mouth tugged. "My men will hold the Dreadfort, then. I prefer a blade to a bruise, but the body needs both. Your Manderley will hold the boy. Your bear will hold the men. You will hold the wall." The realm will not thank you." "I know," Jon said. "The realm never thanks the men who keep its feet out of the fire," Davos muttered. "It thanks the men who bring the firewood and set the pot and say they have made a stew." Melisandre's eyes fixed upon Jon's face. "The snow will rise," she said, "and with it the dead. You will call them by names that were yours for a little time. They will come to take all names away. The wall is not a thing you defend once. You will defend it every morning and every night, and sometimes both at once. Will you do this?" Jon thought of Robb's hand on the vellum, of Meage Mormont dragging a man to sense by his throat, of Manderley beaming like a hearth light in winter, of Rickon's stubborn brow and Shaggy Dog's jaws, of Ghost's cold nose against his palm and the way the gods would breathe under snow. He thought of Eamon's blind eyes and the sound of a raven's wings in a long black night. He thought of little Sam and Sam's big heart and of men who had looked at him with hate and men who had looked at him and seen themselves. A bad mirror but a true one. "I will," he said. They rode north. The wind met them like an old enemy, and it felt like an old enemy greeting an old friend because it had no hate in it, only purpose. The wall rose by inches, and men's hearts rose with it and fell when it swallowed them in its white. A raven came with a letter that smelled of lamp oil and lard. It bore the green wax merman and 3 words that were more than 3. "The North remembers." Ed read it aloud as if he were reading a joke that made him sad. Jon stood on the top of the wall and watched the empty white spread north threaded with blue, and the emptier white spread south threaded with smoke. Ghost pressed at his thigh. The cold took his tears and turned them to salt at the corners of his mouth. "I know," Jon told the white world. "I remember, too." The night that followed had a different quiet to it, taut as a bowstring held and not released. Men moved in the ways men move when they are waiting for a thing they cannot name. Melisandre stood upon the wall with her hands lifted and said words that made the hair move on Jon's arms. He felt the dead watching, the very old dead and the very new. He felt an eye open the way an eye opens under a drift where a man has gone down and not come up again, and the sight of it went through him like iron. He slept because men must. He dreamed because boys do. In his dream, Robb Stark stood on the height of the King's Tower in Winterfell with his hair brown as a chestnut and his crown no heavier than a branch's shadow, and he held a blade that was not steel and not fire but a thing that divided day from night. "I named you," Robb said without moving his mouth, and the voice was in the weirwood leaves and in the snow underfoot and in the breath of the dire wolves. "You were mine to name, but you were yours first. Be that." He turned away and became a boy running with a girl through a corridor that had sunlight in it, and the sun went out as the dream does. Jon woke to horns. The dawn was not red. It was a white so bright it hurt. The shadows on the snow were needles. They came over the ice where no thing should walk, tall and silent and blue with light like moonlight in their eyes. Men shouted. Men prayed. Ghost made a sound that was not a howl and not a growl and all of both. Jon's sword was in his hand before he had known he had moved, and the wall rang with steel, and the fire burned in long red banners out of copper braziers swaying on their chains. "You chose your place," Melisandre hissed, and if she was frightened she made the fear into something useful. "Hold it." He held it, and the men around him held it, and the wall held them all because for that hour it was more than stone and more than ice and more than oath. It was a thing made of men. It did not break. The dead did. They fell into pieces that did not know how to be pieces. The light in their eyes went out as if a cloud had crossed a moon no one had seen. After, they picked up their dead and spoke their names and put them under. Jon stood with his hands on the ice and felt it hum. A low old sound like a song sung by a mouth that had forgotten words and did not need them. He looked south and saw in his mind a boy on a chair he would grow into, a fat lord plodding like a spider with cakes in his hands, a bare woman telling men truths with fewer words than they wanted, a smuggler grinning at a sea he could not sail for snow. He looked north and saw white, and beyond the white a black he had no name for. He thought of his father, and how the man had managed to be the same man in a hall and on a road and under a tree. He thought of the crown his brother had worn and the crown he himself would not. He let his hand rest upon Ghost's head until his fingers went numb. The dire wolf closed his eyes. The wind stopped singing for a heartbeat. In that heartbeat Jon thought he could hear Winterfell breathing. He stood, and the wall stood with him, and below him the north, stubborn and old, began to remember itself night by night. If it had a king, it was Winter. If it had a hand, it was his. He was not lord and would not be. He was a man with a sword and brothers in black an enemy. Who did not breathe. It was enough. When the next raven came from Winterfell, it bore Rickon's clumsy hand and words with ink blots like little wolves. It said that the gods had stopped having bad dreams, and that Shaggy Dog had chewed on Manderly's chair, and that Manderly had laughed until his belly shook, and that there was honey this year because bees were stupid. It said that the north was colder but less mean. It asked when Jon would visit. Said winter smells like iron and good soup. It said, do you remember the way the snow makes the chimneys into wolves? Jon read it aloud on the top of the wall with men who had not had letters in their hands since they had been boys to pass to mothers, and the men laughed, and some of them wept, and Dolorous Ed said that if bees were stupid then they had better company than him, and then he went to check the fires without a word more because that was his way of loving anything. He stood on the heights when the sky went green with cold, and he thought he felt his father's hand on his shoulder and Robb's voice in the snow. He felt the weight of a crown he would not wear pass through him like a wind. He watched the white to the north and the smoke to the south, and the wall sang again, low and old and enduring. Winter was here. The boy who had been named by dead kings and living men was what he had chosen to be in the end. That was not nothing. It was a shape large enough to hold a world while it froze and thawed and froze again. And when ghosts came with old grievances, and when men came with new ones, and when ravens came carrying news written in a hand as clumsy as the paws of a pup and smelling of soup and wolves, Jon Snow listened and answered and kept the watch. They buried their dead before the cold could steal their faces. It was the old way and the only mercy left when the wind would not stop and the sun took too long to rise. Ed Tollett read the names until his voice gave out, and then he read them in a whisper because the names were not for the living ears alone. Jon stood with the rest and felt the walls slow hum under his boots, as if a giant harp lay strung beneath the ice and men's oaths plucked at it whenever their breath fogged. After the last name, the last shovel. After the last shovel, the silence that followed grief like a dog. That night they slept with their boots close by and their hands closer to their knives. Ghost lay across the doorway and let no dream pass without being smelled and named. At dawn there were ravens. One bore the heavy hand of White Harbor, florid and neat at once, like a fat man dancing with astonishing grace. Another bore the tide-stained script that had to be Eastwatch's, as if the letters had been written while the ship rocked and the ink refused to behave. The last was from the Shadow Tower, a spare line or two and a mark that looked like a blade. Jon broke White Harbor's first. There was a bit of spice in the wax like a joke that refused to be solemn. Lord Wyman wrote to say that the boy had taken to his letters like a wolf to raw meat, that the boy would not sit long when told to and could be made to sit longer if a wolf looked at him, that the boy asked after the wall every day in words, and after his brother in ways that made the hall seem to lean in to hear, that Lady Meege had called 3 Freys by their true names and run them out of the west gate with no horses. 2 had fallen into the river, and no one was sorry. That there was a whisper at the merman's court of a great supper to which unwelcome guests would never return, after the winter made them soft and the ovens made them softer. That the north remembered, and not just in wine. Jon folded that one without smiling and kept his fingers from the ink's edge. The second letter spoke of sea teeth and a cold that climbed the masts. It spoke of men crowding the stones at Eastwatch and staring east as if waiting for a city to rise from the water. Hard home, hard home, hard home. The word was written as if it had scraped the parchment. Each line had a smear that might have been sea salt. Dead things in the surf, Cotter Pike wrote without poetry. Lights in the caves. People crawling down the cliffs like spiders with children on their backs. Smoke that smells wrong. We can't get them out with oars. We'd need God's own hand. Send every boat with a bottom that holds. Send fire if you have any. Send the Lord Commander you're going to have if you're going to have him, because this is a thing that needs more than orders. The Shadow Tower's letter was only a sentence. The wood walks at night. Eamon sat with his hands out to the brazier, palms cupped to catch the heat as if it were something that might spill. Jon read the 3 aloud and let the words settle. The old man's blind eyes turned toward the sound of the C letter when Jon read it, as if the salt had a voice only he could hear. "Hard home," Eamon said, and each syllable seemed to take a little heat from his cupped hands. "When I was young, it was a story men told to keep children close to the fire." "Children are close to the fire," Jon said, too quickly, and bit down on the anger before it could be a cruelty. "They are there, if Cotter's right. Men too. Wildlings who did not come when the gates were open. Their winter is at their throats now." "Your winter too," Eamon said mildly, "and ours. But the ice does not part itself out to men as if they were guests at a feast. If you take those people in, you must keep them alive." "Then we will," Jon said, and heard in his own voice the stubborn iron that had made men think of Ned Stark when they looked at him. He almost apologized to the old man for it. He did not. Later, when the day dimmed to a color not yet night, he called the brothers and the wildling captains and whatever officers of Stannis would come. Davos did and would always if there was food for thought or the lack of it. Melisandre came because her shadow came anywhere there was a decision to be made. The hall filled with frost breath and the smell of wool and smoke and cold leather. Jon laid out the letters and set a weight on each to hold them flat. "You want to bring a nest of crows home," Tormund said cheerfully when Jon had done. "Then we'll have crow eggs for breakfast every day." "Good. My belly thinks highly of you." "They're your people," Alliser Thorne said, and the sneer left his mouth only long enough to take a sip of ale and put it back again. "Bring your wildlings home to your wildlings. Leave the watch out of it." "They are men," Jon said, "and women, and children. The wall is for more than us." "The wall is for us," Bowen Marsh put in from his place halfway down the table, where the light did not find him easily. His voice was hoarse with cold and something under the cold. "We took vows to one another. We did not swear to be host to every thief who ever stole a cow from a Karstark field." Tormund snorted. "I stole a cow from a Karstark field once, and it kicked me harder than a woman ever did. If you have a cow to spare, I'll steal it again." "This is not cows." Melisandre put a hand into the brazier's warmth, closer than any other hand would, as if the fire would never hurt her. "Crows," she said, and if the word was used the way the watch used it to speak of itself, there was no mockery in it. "The cold comes whether or not you like the wind's voice. The cold brings dead men to knock on doors. If you do not open to the living now, you will open to the dead later. It is only a question of whose hands do the opening." Davos rapped his knuckles lightly on the table and raised his brows. "We'll need boats to haul folk off that headland," he said. "Even if the seas let us. Even if the drift ice stays thin and polite and doesn't decide to be a wall of its own. As many boats as we can find. Eastwatch has some, but she's no harbor for a fleet, and whatever fishermen make it there have already made it there. White Harbor has boats and men who can think like water. Lord Wyman will send them if I ask," Jon said. "He's sent harder things for less." He did not say bones. Stannis had kept to his own quarters since Winterfell. He came now on the iron of his own will. His presence cooled the room a degree. "You'll send to a fat lord who could use his ships to bring grain from Gulltown instead," the king said. "You'll strip him of his harbor's life for your cliff chalkers. You'll ask him to risk his keels on a frozen sea with no cargo at the end of it." "For men at the end of it," Davos said. Stannis did not look at him. He kept his eyes on Jon as if it were a point of pride in a sword match. "Very well," he said. "Ask your fat lord to send his fattest ships. But while he thinks and dithers and writes, you'll couch this plan in steel. You'll need men to hold a beach none of your men can see. Fire to make the dead into ash that won't rise. If you mean to go, go. Do not waste winter with parchment." "I mean to go," Jon said. "You'll want me then," Tormund said. "You'll want every big belly with good legs and every woman who can cut rope and every boy who can carry a line. I'll go down that cliff if it spits me out again for the fun of it. I've climbed worse to get at a girl who laughed at me." "You'll want the giants," said a soft, scratchy voice from the doorway. One filled it. He had bent to get there and now unfolded like a question asked of the sky. Men who had not gotten used to the sight of him in Castle Black's close spaces made the little wrist flick that men make when they want to ward off a dream. Big men make big ladders. Jon nodded. Not to fight, he said. Not unless there's no choice. Not unless there's no choice, one rumbled back. He looked past Jon as if at something only he could see, and waffled. Ghost lifted his head, red eyes steady, and huffed once. The giant smiled as if the wolf had told him a joke only giants understood. They did not vote. There was no vote to take. The thing held its own weight. They left the hall by 2s and 3s as men go down into a cold they have measured and found that it will not be made warmer by complaint. Bowen Marsh was last. He lingered as if the smoke might offer him a different answer than the air had. When he came to Jon he stopped and drew in a breath that changed nothing. "We will not hold if you empty us," he said. "Then we will not empty us," Jon said. "I will not strip the wall to save people I cannot keep alive if I bring them here." Marsh's eyes were small pearls in the red of his face. "You are not Ned Stark," he said suddenly, as if there had been an argument and he had been losing it in his head for some time. "And this is not your hall." "No," Jon said. He kept his voice quiet because anything louder would be a wrong he could not take back. "This is ours." Marsh flinched as if from weather. He looked past Jon as if there were a door he could take that would lead him to a world in which things were still sensible. Finding none, he bowed a quick bow that hurt to see and went. They made lists. They always made lists. Men who could handle lines in bad weather. Men who could bring a boat through a crowded surf. Men who could stand in a skiff with a bow in hand and not fall into the water when the boat dipped. Men who could cook something a man would eat when the cold made his teeth hurt. Surprised Jon sometimes how much of a war was counting. Counting arrows. Counting loaves. Counting the hours until an ice fog rolled in. Counting the words you had left that men would hear in your voice. He slept little. When he did, the dreams came quick as breaths. In one of them, the godswood at Winterfell put on furs and came to stand on the wall. A great white antlered thing with a face carved in its bark that opened its mouth and breathed out a cold so clean it stripped his bones of every name that had ever been given him. He woke with Ghost's head on his chest and the wolf's breath like a forge against his ribs. The morning after that they made a Lord Commander. Jon had not asked for it. He had told Aemon that he did not want it and told Stannis that he would not let him arrange it. But men had been dying for him and living because of him for long enough now that whatever the paper said, the air in the hall bent around his chair. He had to say words to straighten it. They assembled in the yard where the sun gave only a weak promise and the wind kept even promises weak. The brothers of the watch stood where they had stood for 1,000 years, and looked at one another with the faces of men who had left their names behind with their shoes at some old river and had not thought to ask for them back. The old way demanded that 3 men be put forward. Ed gave a little speech for Othel Yarwick that made Yarwick blush and scowl both, and Othel scuffed his boot in the snow and pretended to study the grain of the wood in the gate as if it were better than men's eyes. Ser Dennis Mallister could not be there, but his name was named and men looked southward without meaning to. Bowen Marsh's name was said by a man whose voice had been his once upon a time and was not now because loss changes voices. There was no one to speak for Jon. The silence grew like frost on iron. Then Tormund said, "He holds his shit and he holds a sword and he holds his word," and folded his big arms as if that were enough. It was. More men spoke after that, but they were only remarks to the same point. They dropped their tokens in wooden bowls. Sam had been the one in Jon's memory who made the counter bend for him. Here there was no Sam and no counter that wanted bending. A boy with a runny nose and careful fingers did the counting while Aemon listened and the ravens watched and croaked when he turned each piece by touch. The boy called the name and the bird called after him. Jon did not look toward Bowen Marsh when the numbers made what he had known they would make. "Come," Aemon said, his voice thin and bright like frost. "The wall asks a lord for its command. You are its answer. There will be time to regret it later." Jon went to one knee in the snow and said the words men had said before him until the sound of them had shaped the old stones. The brothers thumped spear butts and boot heels. There was an order when it ended. He gave all the orders he had been holding in his chest. Yarwick to ready the catwalks. Sather to check the oil, Olivar to tally arrows. PYP and Gren should have been there in this particular counting, and were not, and the gap of their absence made a place where words slipped and fell. He swallowed that and moved on. Then there was Janos Slint. They had been avoiding one another. The man had an odor like old gravy poured over something worse. Now he stood with the rest, his lips wet with a smile that was not a smile. Jon gave him Greyguard, a ruined place with a name like a rebuke that needed men and work and patience. Slint sneered at patience and knew of work only as something for other men to do. Take men. Fix it. You will command there. Slint laughed. You will command here. I will warm my arse in this hall and laugh when you fall off your wall and break it with your bastard skull. There was a stillness in which the whole yard heard each other breathe. Jon gave him the excuse and the exit. Sir, that is an order. Slint gave himself a different answer. Then order me when you have a name that is not a stain. It was not rage that closed Jon's throat. It was something colder. He heard his father's voice say a few old true things about words and men and the size of a man's name. He felt his own hand move. 1-1, he said quietly without looking away from Slint. Take him outside. The giant did, with a care that would have been tender if a man had not kicked and spat as he was lifted like a squalling child. The yard filled with men and breath and iron. Jon followed and took up Longclaw. He had not meant to behead a man in the yard the day he was named. He had not meant a great deal of his life so far. He did the thing anyway because not doing it would eat at the men who had put their chips in the bowl and at his own bones. Janos Slint spat in his face. He wiped it away with the back of his glove and cut once. The blade went through, clean as winter. The yard took the news without joy and without distaste. It took it as it took all news, as a change in the weather that must be dressed for. Bowen Marsh did not look away, and in that not looking Jon saw the place where something had set. He wondered if there were words that could unset it. He doubted it. He gave the body to the fire. If the dead were watching, let them see that much and make of it what they liked. They moved fast after that. Eastwatch's letter went back with a double hand of men who could drive a boat hard without cursing even when cursing would steady a man's hand. Ravencoats flew for White Harbor and Long Lake and the island of Skagos where Manderley knew the names of currents even when the currents had changed their minds. Stannis's man at Eastwatch counted stores and scowled at the numbers. Melisandre watched the fire with her head tilted like a bird listening for snakes. She said little, which frightened men more than when she said much. 3 days after the counting, a rider came in with ice beads in his beard, and a woman behind him who had shaved her head to keep the lice from winning more often than they lost. The rider slid from his saddle and steadied himself with a hand on the horse's neck and said without preamble, "Hardhome's not a place, it's a question." He looked at Jon then, and his eyes were red with salt wind. "Cotter says if you mean to answer it, you should bring your wolf." "I was going," Jon said. "I will." "Then we'll go before the sea decides she's land after all," the rider said. Someone led him away. The woman behind him clutched at the saddle until her knuckles were bone. The night before they left, Jon went up alone to the top of the wall and stood where the wind could talk to him without interruption. Ghost leaned into his thigh and made a bracket of his body against it. The moon was a shard. He thought of Winterfell's godswood again, and the way snow lay along the carved eyebrows as if the gods had grown old and white. He feared for a moment that if he closed his eyes and asked, some answer would come in a voice that was not a voice at all but a smell of leaves and a feeling of being watched. He did not close his eyes. He watched the dark. Footsteps came, padded and even. Melisandre stood beside him and did not shiver. She looked east, as if fires burned there under the water. "You ride with a wolf and a giant and a wild man to fetch a people that are not yours," she said. "I have looked for this in my flames for longer than you have had a beard." He did not take his gaze from the black. "What did the flames tell you?" "That the boy would refuse a crown and take a road instead," she said. "That the road would lead under the water and not by ship. That the water would have hands. That the hands would be colder than iron. That a name would come back from a place where names go to be forgotten. Would you like me to tell you that the people you ride to fetch will all sit by your fire and sing your name and be grateful? I will not lie to you, Jon Snow. Some will bite, some will eat, some will join your enemies because their fear will tell them to. But the others do not sort their harvest. They will take all. Better the living who bite than the dead who do not. He turned his head to look at her then, because he had to. And what will you do while I'm gone? Count the fires, she said, smiling as if a cruel joke were a kindness. And keep them lit. They left in the gray hour when men forget whether they are awake or asleep. The road to Eastwatch was a ridged line of old ice and new snow. Men moved down it like beetles across sugar. Ghost ranged before and behind. One walked in the ruts that wagons had made and turned them into deeper ruts. Tormund sang at first, then saved his breath for laughing at the cold. The Black brothers kept their faces tucked into their scarves and took their steps as they had taken 1,000 steps in their years at the wall. One after another, stubborn as rain. Eastwatch had the look of a place that had been told a secret it did not want. Its piers were crusted with frost that did not melt even when men put boots on it. Its tower had acquired a fringe of icicles like teeth. I'll have to move boats farther out lest he mistake them for toys. Do you have boats? Jon asked. It seemed a fair question. Enough to be too few, Pike grunted. Enough to drown some and save others. Come look. They looked. There were boats. Not enough. There never would be. They were stout little things with bellies broad enough to hold frightened men and high prows to cheat spray. They bobbed like corks and slapped water with their sides as if to reassure themselves that they were still more wood than ice. Men with the look of gulls about the eyes climbed in and out of them with lines in their hands, and the lines moved as if they had memories. The wind shifted while they talked. It came off the sea and brought with it a smell like bruised kelp and something farther away and dry. It made the hairs on Jon's neck stand up. Ghost sneezed and shook himself as if to lighten a weight only he felt. They left men to the work at Eastwatch and moved farther up the coast with a handful of skiffs dragged by teams of shaggy garrons. This was not a thing men did to drag boats along ice. It was a thing men did when winter laughed at them and asked for a trick they had not thought of. One took up a twined rope in his huge hands and trudged with the others, and when the ground heaved, he heaved back. The cliffs of Hardhome rose like the ribs of some old giant lying on his side. Smoke curled from the caves cut into them. There were figures on the ledges, small and moving, and the movement did not look like the movement of men who thought the world would give them anything. The beach was not a beach so much as a place where the rocks were lower and the sea had found them. The waves did not ought to be. They came in without white, slipped under black water, and hissed like meat on a pan. Dead things in the water, a brother muttered, as if by speaking he could get the word out of his throat and be rid of it. He was not rid of it. Jon did not make a speech. He put men in boats and sent the boats into water that did not want them. He set archers on the rocks and told them to shoot anything that moved wrong. He put Tormund in the first boat with men who had climbed worse to get less. He watched ropes snake out and take strain. He watched the boats slew sideways and straighten. He watched people come down the cliffs with bundles that were babies and bundles that were old men and bundles that were nothing but sacks of stale oats. He watched the sea answer. It was not a wave. It was a wall that moved. It swept in with a sound like wind in 1,000 dead leaves. It was not water. It was bodies, hands, faces that had learned nothing from gravity. The archers began to shoot and forgot what arrows were when they saw that the things that looked like men did not crumple until they were cut to rags. The first boat took a wave of dead hands across its bow, and a boy went over the side with a scream that kept going until it did not. One waded out as far as his thighs and smashed at the things with a boat. Hook bigger than a man, and the old or made a sound like a tree hitting rock every time he brought it down. The gray water went black and then red and then black again. Fire, Jon said. He had told himself that he would not say that until he had to. He said it now because it was now. Pitch went up. Oil went up. Arrows arced and landed, and the black water made a noise like a thing offended. The dead burned slowly when they were wet. They burned. They worked in breaths. In each breath a boat came in and another went out, and men were pulled up and men were pulled under. In each breath a woman's face appeared out of smoke and became a woman's back bent under a bundle, and became hands reaching up to a boat's gunwale, and became fingers on a rope, and became knuckles white as bone. In each breath a child cried and stopped. In each breath a man coughed and could not stop. The sun tipped and then didn't, because the sky here did not seem to be ordered by any rules men knew. Tormund came up a rope with a girl under one arm as if she were a sack of salt, and dropped her into a boat, and would have gone back into the surf if Jon's glare had not been a command he knew how to obey. "There are old ones in holes," the big man panted, teeth white in his red beard. "There are bones that move. The caves are wrong. The mountain breathes cold." He spat out seawater and did not ask Jon to do anything other than what he was doing. Night came like a lid. The sea hissed. The dead kept coming as if they had been ordered to and did not know how to stop being obedient. The boats were fewer, then they were more, then they were fewer. A horse screamed, which was useless and true. One went to his knees and came up again with a wreath of limbs around him like a man crowned with some monstrous honor. The crown fell away in pieces that smoked. Ghost's fur went dark with spray and other things. Jon lost count. He did not know how many they had taken until a voice near his ear said in a flat tone, 1,803, and he knew then that he had been counting anyway. He turned his head. The old woman with the shaved scalp stood there, huddled in one of the black cloaks the watch had brought. Her eyes were pits. She repeated the number as if it tasted odd, and she wished to be certain. "How many left?" Jon asked. She looked up the cliffs as if they were a story told badly. More. Always more. They did not stop. They stamped fire into what could not be hauled. They burned rope to cut it where hands had knitted it to other hands. They carried one another when legs failed. When the sea went quiet, it was not because the dead had run out. It was because the others had decided that the game had changed and they had a different piece to play. He saw one at dawn. They moved as if the nature of walking had been explained to them once and they had improved upon it. It stood on a cairn of wet rock high above the boat line and looked down upon the living with an interest that was not like hunger and not like curiosity. Its eyes held a color you do not say aloud. Its armor was a memory of ice, and the memory was better than the thing. It turned a little, as if to show itself to each of them in turn, so that later they would not say they had seen a trick of light. Jon put his hand to the dragonglass dagger at his belt and felt fooled by it. There was so much cold in the thing above him that the warmth of the glass in his hand seemed foolish, like a child's candle held up in a storm. He drew it anyway because there are many kinds of folly and not all of them are shame. He did not have to use it. The thing watched as if satisfied of something and then turned away. The shadow went with it. When it was gone, the day became day again, able to be counted in cups of water and breaths of wind. When it ended, it did not end. They hauled what they could. They left what they could not. They set fires that were still burning when the tide took them and made noises like animals dying. They staggered back up the coast like men who had fought a storm into an agreement that the storm would break them later at its convenience. Jon's sword hand ached. His jaw ached. His heart ached in a way he would not describe because men would think it poetry. Back at Eastwatch, Cotter Pike watched the first boats come in and did not ask how many. He counted mouths and decided how many mouths he could feed until the next ships came, and told the remainder how long hunger would last. It was a cruel count and a true one. Jon had no better count to give him. He sent ravens anyway, because if the sea would not move for him, perhaps Wyman Manderley would. Perhaps the Fat Lord would find, deep in himself, the part of a man who loves and send his ships into waters that did not want them and come back 14 lighter and call it luck. Perhaps. They did a smaller thing. They had done a miracle and put it in the workroom, and now they had to mend its seams. Jon returned to Castle Black with 300 more mouths than he had taken. He watched them look at the wall and make their mouths into shapes that were not words. He watched the men of the watch look at the wildlings as if a dog had been trained to speak and might forget its manners any moment. He set tents. He rationed oil like a miser. He kept fires lit without setting the wall itself to smoking. He made beds near the yards where men trained with spears so that when the drums began, The men in the beds would think of war faster than they thought of hunger. He found work for everyone with hands. He found work for some without. If he could not feed your belly, he would feed you purpose. When he slept, it was not on purpose. He dreamed of a hall with rose tapestries faded to stone and a boy climbing under the board with a knife to cut the cheeks of anyone who put their leg down. He dreamed of Robb's handwriting becoming snow. He dreamed of the sea pulling a cloak over its head. He woke T. O. Dolorous Ed saying in a tone that would have been funny if it had not been so thinly held. A raven from White Harbor, my lord. Also some rat that thinks it's a raven. The letter said that Lord Wyman had sent ships, and that 3 had come back and 2 had not, and 1 had returned strung with ice like bells. It said that the ovens at White Harbor were working. It said that 3 Freys had disappeared into the kind of silence that a town keeps when it does not wish to have to explain itself later. It said that Rickon had thrown a boot at a maester and then apologized, making the apology as if the boot had thrown itself and he had been very disappointed in it. It asked again, in ink blots that were wolves, when Jon would visit. Another raven took a place by the brazier and opened its beak to complain. The ribbon on its leg was a dirty white, and the knot was one used by men who had learned their knots on the wrong side of rivers. The letter inside was written in a tidy hand that did not fit the words it wrote. The king beyond the wall is not ash, it said. The king you burned was a bone in a suit with the wrong man's name on it. The man you wanted to turn to smoke is where smoke likes to be. He does not thank you for this. He says a crown is a joke that men tell themselves when they are afraid to look at the sky. He says a name is another kind of crown. He says if you want your fake wolf back, you can come take her out from under the ground where wolves do not go willingly. He says bring wine. Jon read it twice. He felt the old deep weariness that came with Melisandre's games and with the things men did because they did not know how to make sense of a world where dead men walked. He felt another thing too, quieter and more complicated, that had the shape of relief. He went to the yard and found Melisandre there, watching the men drag a log across snow. You did not kill Mansraider, he said without a voice that accused, because accusation would waste time. I killed a lie, she said. He used it poorly. He used it well. He is alive. He loved a woman once. He will love a people always. He is a man who cannot help himself. He will love the way a man works stone with his hands and forgets how to hate a man while he is doing it. Why tell me now? Because now is when your work touches his, she said, as if she were explaining weather. Winterfell has rooms under it that hold more than old bones. Mance knows the paths. He goes where songs go to learn how to end. A king should be underground, once, if he means to be any use above it. Don't call me that, Jon said. She watched his face. I did not, she said softly. Not then. The ground under Winterfell did not give up its secrets easily. Men had died in those black ways and their deaths had not made the walls any kinder. The letter that had told Jon of Mance had told him something else. It said that a woman with a face like someone's little sister and a name like someone else's had been smuggled from one hall to another in the middle night and had slipped between fires like a word slipping between men's teeth. It said that Manderly's men had seen her disappear into a hole with a man whose voice knew 1,000 songs about mending and only one about breaking. It said that Davos Seaworth had went down a set of worn steps with a torch in one hand and a prayer in the other, and had come up with his prayer blackened and his torch gone. Jon did not ride to Winterfell. He said as much with letters that smelled of smoke and respect. He asked questions that any lord would. He sent men who could do what he could not. Listen to rats with their eyes, hear the way stones talk to ankles under boots. A month later, Davos came back to the wall with salt in his beard and a look like a man who had gone under and found that the world above is only another layer of water. He brought Mance Rayder with him, less a king than a shadow who had learned to carry knives again. The wildling's hair had gone whiter. His voice had not gone anywhere. He met Jon's gaze with a soldier's calculation and then broke the calculation with a crooked smile. You burn another man in my place, Mance said. They'll stop jumping on the fire when you tell them to do it. I'm not in the habit, Jon said. You are, Mance said, and looked at Melisandre over Jon's shoulder as if the two of them had made a child once and the child had run off into the fog. But not in that one. He put out his hands and the chains clinked as if applauding themselves. Take these off. I am not your enemy. Not today. Are you anyone's friend? Davos asked mildly. Winter's, Mance said. He tilted his head. And his, he added, nodding toward Ghost, who only looked at him and did not answer. And yours, Stark's boy. Don't argue. I have done more for men I liked less. Jon led him to a fire and a bowl of stew and let him eat while the wind threw handfuls of snow against the shutters without order. He asked his questions when the man's hands stopped shaking. The girl is not your sister, Mance said. She smelled wrong. She said the wrong names in her sleep. She was someone else's child that men put in a wolfskin and told to howl. The one you want is a scent in the woods that will not be caught. She runs, that one. I like her. The one I brought out of the hall. He shrugged. She was not a wolf. She was a girl. I chose the girl because wolves can run and girls cannot always. I took my girls with me and we went under the ground. Men followed. Some came back. I came back. Because I am old and so I am too stubborn to die. Where is she now? Jon asked. Not with me, Mance said. With a storm. With a man who owes too much to too many and thinks he can pay with blood other than his own. With a letter that thinks it is more than it is. Winterfell, Davos said. There are more rats in that place than bread. I am glad to be above snow and hungry again. Melisandre watched Mance eat. As if she were trying to see which of the fires in him could be used to light the rest of the world. You went under a castle and came up with only your breath, she said softly. Some men come up with ghosts that sit on their shoulders and whisper until they walk off a roof. Do your ghosts whisper? Only to say I sing in the wrong key, Mance said. I know that. I cannot help it. They made a peace with him that was not a peace in any other man's book but held, which was better than a peace. He slept and woke and slept again. He did not thank anyone. He spoke with Tormund like two dogs that had run the same ground and had to explain it to one another in smells. He grinned at Bowen Marsh and measured him without interest. He took a knife when one was offered and returned it when asked. He hummed when he thought no one could hear. Jon heard. The tune was one he had known 1,000 nights ago, when the world was small enough to be held under Winterfell's roofs. Days lengthened without warming. The wall did not care. The wildlings in tents began to look at one another with thin faces and thin wrists. Wyman Manderley sent flour turned gray with age and insisted that it was only the cask that had turned on the journey and not the grain. Men turned it into bread because they had the habit of not dying. From the west came a rumor that the Riswells had decided their horses needed shoes made of iron that was not in their forges, and had gone to fetch some from men who did not care for the gift. From the east came a rumor that a ship with a swan on its prow had cut through a pack of ice like a good knife through old cheese and sailed on toward skies that did not promise anything. Ravens brought news that could not keep its own feet under it. They came again, then the others. This time they did not come in a rush. They came in a line, one by one, with the contempt a man has for an opponent he has measured and found smaller than he remembered. They came when the moon was a coin a miser would not spend. They came along the path that led across the top of the wall itself, which no thing that was not living had ever walked, and the way they did it was wrong. Men do not walk that way. The wind does not blow that way. Stories do not go that way. Jon watched them from the east tower and felt a confusion he would not call fear because fear would be simpler. Melisandre asked him for his sword. He gave it to her. She did not heed it. She did not curse it. She tied around the grip a strip of cloth from some place Jon did not know. She cut her own palm and let the blood clot where it touched steel. She handed it back as if it were a bread knife. Do not try to be a hero, she said. You are no use as a dead hero. If you can be a man, the cold cannot count. They held them. The first of the others came within arm's length and then farther than an arm, time doing something slippery under the moons. Jon thought he would die many times in a row and did not. He cut and the blade moved as if the air wanted it to. One's hand came down like a falling star and the dead objected and could not. Tormund roared and the sound put an old memory in the ice. the one that remembers when wolves and men howled together and did not care which was which. Men fell and stood up with eyes that were not their eyes and fell again. The blue light went out when certain small things were done. Dragonglass made the sound of a window being opened when none could be opened. When it ended, there was no cheer. There was only the tired after a man has decided 3 times in an hour not to run. The wall bled where men had bled upon it. The wind whistled through broken teeth in the balustrade and sounded like farther places. The dead they could not burn they took far away and covered with stones that were good at keeping secrets. In Winterfell a boy grew. He learned to sit in a chair without his feet leaving the floor, which was a different learning than a lord's. He learned to hear a lie before it finished being said. He learned to say his dead brother's name and not make men cry when he did. He learned to love a place and not love only how it made him feel. He learned to let Lady Meage make choices as if they were his, because that made them his. He learned to trust Sir Robert Glover's grudges because they were kept in proper order. He learned to roll his eyes at Wyman Manderley's jokes and to laugh when the laughter would do good and to look away when the laughter would break a man. He learned not to put his hands in Shaggy Dog's mouth. He learned to listen to the gods in the snow. Sometimes he sat under the heart tree, when the air was so cold that his lashes froze and the world was very still, and he would say aloud a list: Mother, Father, Robb, Bran, Arya, Sansa, Jon. And when he said Jon, he would look south and he would not know why. A raven came on a day so clear that Winterfell's chimneys looked close enough to pinch between finger and thumb. It landed at Manderley's elbow while he was telling a story about a woman who had a fish for a husband, and whether this was a good or bad bargain and what a fish would do with dowry. The ribbon on its leg was black. Manderley undid the knot and held the letter up so that the light found it. He read it and his face changed. Not like a candle being snuffed, but like a fire being banked so it could live until morning. He took the boy's hand and gave him the letter. Rickon frowned at the words and mouthed them, and then he looked up. He had his father's eyes in that moment, which made Manderley's throat feel small. He says the dead are like snow, Rickon said. That if you do not shovel they will make a roof that breaks the house. He says not to be afraid of men who cannot count. He says do not send me south. He says he will come when he can, and he will not come when he should, and I am not to try to untie the knot his words make in my head because the knot is the only reason it is not a arrow. Bah! He looked at the old lord. What does it mean? Manderley smiled and did not say that he had no idea. It means that your brother writes like a man who has too much to do, he said. It means that he loves you without saying so. It means that we will keep the ovens hot. Rickon nodded as if this were the only answer the letter could have meant. I will go and see the tree, he said, and he went and no one stopped him. By spring, if the word meant anything but a change in the color of the dark, the shape of the north had changed. The Freys went home to die in their hall so far south the river was still water and not a knife. The Karstarks sent a man with a cloak made of 2 creatures to say that they had been misled and would like to be misled by men with better faces. Moore's Umber sent a finger again because he had more. Houses that had been silent decided to make a noise. Manderley baked. Glover sharpened. Meage was a storm that came into rooms and left them better. At the wall, the watch did what it had always done. It stood. It mended. It waited. It froze. It loved in ways men do when their lives are not theirs, by cooking, by lending a mitten, by not saying a man's name the night his wound broke open, by letting him say his father's name and not mocking him for it. Jon had 100 talks in which he said no and 100 more in which he said yes and one in which he said nothing for a long time and then said, all right, because a boy was staring at him with eyes that wanted his mother. He saw 100 chances to die that would have been better stories and did not take them because he had chosen to live. It is harder to choose over and over than once. Bowen Marsh tried, once, in a dusk that would not become night, to make a new world with a knife. He came upon Jon at the base of the outer stairs with a handful of men whose faces had slid away from them when their anger took hold. He said, and got no further, because Ghost knew the sound of a word that would make his man die and put himself between teeth and throat. It was not a hero's moment. The old man's knife nicked fur and did no more. One's shadow fell across the yard before any blade could be drawn. The giant plucked the knife from Bowen's hand as if it were a splinter and flicked it into a snowbank where it vanished into white. For a long heartbeat no one breathed. Then Jon said quietly, into the terror, "There is enough cold in the world. Put that down." And the men did. No one spoke of it after. Men were kinder to Bowen Marsh after that, which is the worst thing for a man who has something bad in him and has been denied the chance to let it out. Sam wrote once from Old Town, and his letter smelled of lamp oil and old vellum and wet stone. He wrote of a glass candle that had been dark for a century, lighting for him with no tinder. He wrote of books that had been bound when Aegon wore a boy's shoes. He wrote of a blade that drank light and a map that showed the world as if it had never had a war in it. He wrote of a word that meant fire in a language no man had spoken in 1,000 years, and how it tasted when you said it. He asked after Jon's health with a care that made Jon fold the letter and put it away and not open it again for 3 days, because no one at the wall asked after his health because there was none to have. He wrote of dragonglass and the caves under Dragonstone where the floor was glass made by fire. He wrote, hesitantly at the end, that a Targaryen girl far away had walked out of fire with lizards that breathed steam, and this was likely nonsense but useful nonsense. Jon smiled down at the words and did not tell anyone the smile had been there. He wrote back that the wall held. He did not say how. One morning a white raven landed on the roof of the rookery at Castle Black, pecked at the ice, and waited with the impatience of a creature that knows itself to be beautiful. Maester Aemon put his hand to it, and the bird hopped onto his wrist as if it had been waiting for that wrist all its days. He opened the message with fingers that hummed, and read it and nodded, and told Jon and anyone who could hear that the citadel had declared winter. The word went out under the wall and over it and into halls where fires thought themselves big and onto seas where ice laughed at oars. It did not change a single thing, and it changed everything, because a word from a place where words were kept as if they were treasure has a way of making men see what their eyes have put off seeing. They took stock. They had not enough of anything and a little of everything and a great number of men. They had wolves. They had a giant. They had a red woman who watched fire and made the fire watch back. They had a boy in Winterfell who wrote letters that smelled of honey and dogs. They had a smuggler who smiled into a wind that had no humor. They had a fat lord who could talk a cow out of its milk and a bear woman who could talk a man out of his pride. They had a song under the ice and hands on the stones. They had Jon Snow, who had been named something he would not be and had chosen to be the thing no one else would because it was the only thing he could trust. When the first real blizzard came, the kind that erases thought and writes itself in a man's lungs, Jon walked the top of the wall with his cloak wrapped high and his hair frozen in points and Ghost near enough to trip him and catching him every time. He thought of Robb, who would have laughed at how ugly the world looked and how clean. He thought of Ned, who would have pointed to a spot in the white and told a boy that there was a tree there. Look, see how the wind argues with it and does not win. He thought of the decrees and wills of dead kings and of crowns that were only circles of words. He thought of hard homes and soft ones and the places men keep under their skins to hide the things that hurt. He stopped by the fire cages and fed them with oil measured by a man who could count and not count wrong on purpose. The flames shook their heads and then steadied. He put his bare hand for an instant into one of them to feel. It hurt. It had to. He drew it out and the night took his breath away and gave it back grudgingly. A shape moved in the white beyond the light's reach. Ghost's head came up. Jon stood very still and told his heart to be quiet, which it ignored. The shape resolved into a man with a fur hood rimed stiff. A man carrying something before him as if it were a fragile animal. Jon stepped forward because whoever you are a man, and men go forward when other men need them to. The man took down his hood and became a face that had known calling and answering both. It was a face that had never stopped moving long enough to belong to a place. Mance Rayder's grin cut sideways. "I brought you a song," he said. He handed over the bundle. It was a horn wrapped in furs that had once belonged to some large thing and did again. The horn had writing on it in a script that did not decide whether it wanted to be letters or vines. Jon did not recognize it. He recognized the way his fingers felt stupid on it. "It will not be blown," Mance said. "Or it will. It comes with its own stories tied to it like bells. I sang them until my mouth was dry. It did not make the horn any more or less true. Keep it and show it and do not believe in it. That is the trick with all king's toys. He looked out into the white where the world was made and remade with each breath. They are out there, he said without strain. They are counting. They like to count. They are learning our sums. Then we will learn theirs, Jon said. Mance's grin widened, amused and fierce at once. That's the spirit of a bad idea that works. I'll see to your people in the old forest, the ones you don't want in here because they bite your brothers on the way to the ale. They're the ones that will live because they know how to chew. Keep your red woman where the fire is. Keep your giant where the ground is soft. Keep your heart where a man can find it when he needs to borrow some. When will you come back? Jon asked. When it suits me, Mance said. He lifted his hood. Don't wait. Or do. I have never met a man who waited well, and the ones who try are the ones you need when the waiting ends. He went into the snow, and the snow took him, and the wall hummed a little as if something under it had liked that talk. After that, there were more days like that first day and a few unlike any other. There were births and sheep skinned and quarrels over a piece of wood that had a good grain for a ladle. There were men who went off the wall and men who were brought back and some who were not. There were letters that said nothing and letters that said too much and letters that were only drawings of wolves with tongues like banners. There were times when the fires burned low and the oil was slow to pour and the men looked with eyes that did not know what they were seeing. And there were times when laughter showed its yellow teeth and warmed a room for an hour. There were times when the others did not come and men did not trust it and could not sleep. He went south to Winterfell twice more in those seasons when the cold made seasons a strange word. He went because a boy asked and because a woman with scars like claws around her mouth wrote to say there was a quarrel only he could break without breaking a house. He did not wear a crown. He wore a black cloak. He sat in the hall with all its shapes changed and recognized under the changes a set of shadows that had been there when he was small. He knelt in the gods' wood. He spoke to a tree that held its counsel. He walked along the top of the outer wall and counted stones that had names he could not find now. He told Rickon stories he had not meant to remember, and when the boy fell asleep he sat and watched the fire burn and thought of the stories he would not tell. When he left, both times it tore at him. He went anyway. He took the tearing and made out of it a rope and tied it to the wall. He did not tell anyone the knot he used. On a night late in a winter that thought itself young, a storm came from the north with the sound of something taking a deep breath. The sky cleared while the wind still blew as if someone had remembered to blow out a candle and forgotten to stop. The stars came out in a cold that made them seem not only bright but close. Jon walked the top and his breath made a little world around his face. He thought he heard singing. It might have been ice settling. It might have been something older. He stopped where the blue shadows begin and put his palm flat to the ice. The hum came up into his bones and stayed. He closed his eyes then. The gods, if they listened, did not speak in words. He let the hum be the words. He let the vow he had made a dozen ways and once in a voice heard by men be the answer. He named the men he had buried in the last week. He named the boys who had learned to fletch arrows and the old women who had learned to tie lines without asking a man. He named Rickon. He named Ghost, whose breath fogged against his wrist and licked him with a tongue as warm and real as anything in that old world of bread and quarrels and soft beds and mothers telling you to shut the door against the draft. He named Robb one last time, and let the name go into the ice and be kept there. The wind changed and brought with it a smell like wood smoke from far away. He opened his eyes and saw, southward, beyond the dark tangle of forest and the low white of fields, a curl of gray that could have been a cottage's morning fire and could have been a town and could have been anything. He thought of a fat man and a bear and a wolf boy and a smuggler, and he smiled into the cold because it did not care and he did. The wall held. He held it. He was not a lord. He was not a king. He was a man who knew the names of the men in HEIR's charge and some of the women and a few of their children and one of their dogs. He was the shape that stood between winter and a place where men still told jokes badly around bread. He was the answer to someone else's question and the question to which others were the only answer possible. He was Jon Snow. The hum in the ice approved, in its old, untranslatable way, and he turned his face into the wind and breathed.